So what I love working with are people, technology, business models, which actually create rather than, delete. I often say to music technology companies, you get put in one of two buckets. Are you a maker? Are you a taker? For me, I think the biggest opportunity in the music industry is this connective layer of data, which sounds really, 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 really boring. But actually, it's tremendously exciting and the opportunities are huge. Working with sports clubs and brands that I do, the opportunity to tap into data, what it can do. We, as a music industry, we've got so much to learn. So much to learn. There is nothing that you will be able to do that would have the greatest input to output ratio as a human being, as mentoring. One conversation, one email, one phone call can change your life. Why wouldn't you? I just don't see why you wouldn't. Tileyard was grown, not built. Much more like farming. Understanding where you plant things, where things will catch, where they'll grow, what needs to go fallow. I've seen how you've programmed it over the years.
You excited about the future?
Oh, very much. It's not boring, that's for sure.
Welcome to Tileyard, the secret sauce, the podcast that brings you behind the scenes at Europe's largest creative community. I'm your host, Nick Keynes, and each episode we'll be chatting with the game changers, disruptors, and innovators who are shaping the future of the music industry right here at Tileyard. Get ready for some incredible stories and inspirational characters. Let's go.
Cliff,
Nick,
the moment has come.
Finally.
So we've known each other, I hate to think, probably 25 years, certainly 20. So I know a lot about you, but I guess people listening to this, everyone knows you. But if they don't know you, maybe an overview just from in your words as to what you do and who you are.
So my name's Cliff. I'm a lawyer by training, but I identify as legal curious. I started my legal career 30 years ago last month. Soon after qualifying, I ran away and joined the circus of the music industry in the mid-90s, had a fantastic 5 years in the record business, arguably one of its most interesting and challenging periods. I then spent a few years in the world of broadcast at a time of disruption. And then close to 20 years ago, I decided that I wanted to set up my own legal practice focused on digital media and brands. It's around that time we reconnected, when you were looking to disrupt in that world. And really my real focus was on disruptive business models. And in terms of the biography bits of it as well, I'm the vice chair of Help Musicians, which is the Musicians Benevolent Fund, and I'm chair of Music Minds Matter about mental health in the music industry. For all the craziness of music and tech, really at the end of the day, I adore creators and want to do everything I can to help.
I mean, interestingly, where to start, right? Because that's one of the things I've always loved about you, and one of the reasons I wanted to start this podcast. So, I've had the privilege of so many amazing conversations with people like yourself. But I suppose going back to the very beginning, so law, I mean, typically, again, another thing is you wouldn't necessarily think of the career you've had and the word and law and that legal, the background of what you do. It's such a diverse industry, the creative industries are so diverse. But going right to the beginning, did you always have a dream of, or an aspiration to get into the sort of the media and the music and media side, or was it?
Well, if you want to go to the original origin story, so the mid-origin story was when I was choosing what subjects I wanted to do and think about. I was born, to quote the Steve Martin line, I was born a poor black child. I was raised on council estate in East London, born of immigrant stock, very, very poor. And I had this overwhelming sense that if life was a game, law was the rules. And I could see a lot of my classmates were looking to cheat the rules. And I thought, well, if you want to win at the game, it's quite helpful to know the rules. And I remember that. That's not retrospectoscope. I remember that being very firmly that was my route out of it. Actually, the first thing I wanted to be was a pharmacist, hilariously. Probably because so many of my classmates ended up as drug dealers. Anyway, but I had this overwhelming sense of just this whole idea of law. But with regard to music, tracing my origin story back, it goes back to the age of 3. One of my earliest memories was of my father having no money but bringing a piano home, and for my brother, who's a few years older, and he played the piano, And then he just gave up. And I just used to adore and love this piano. And then when we fell on hard times, the piano had to be sold. And I just remember this piano being winched out of our flat as being one of the saddest things I can remember, genuinely.
Yeah.
And it was just one of those things that made me think that. And then at school, my school was so poor that they actually stopped all music lessons. It's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about the importance of music education. So being deprived of those options, but I just consumed music like crazy. On the radio, I remember the Capital Radio Fun Bus coming to my estate and Kenny Everett throwing me this sticker. And, and I grew up being the world's biggest fans of Prince and R.E.M. and the Smiths and Madonna. The world that I could be working for those labels and meeting a lot of those people, or could be helping to run Capital Radio. It kind of blows my mind, really. But those don't feel accidental to me with regard to that. But I suppose if you really want to get very psychological about it, maybe I should be lying down, Nick, rather than sitting here, is actually, I always say that what happened to my father. So when my father came to the UK, he was a tailor. And he was a very, very good tailor.
Actually, he's Mauritian, your dad,
yeah? Yeah, so my parents came from Mauritius, which was a British colony. And just before Mauritius got independence, they said to a bunch of the people there, come to the UK, there'll be jobs for you and you'll be very welcome. One of those statements were true because you're British citizens. So my parents came over in 1967. And I was born a few years later. But my father was a tailor, and he was a very good tailor. Even he worked on Savile Row for a while and, made suits for the rich and famous. But, within 15 years, technology, globalization, changing consumer habits, he's out of a job. Now, you've got centuries, if not millennia, of men having clothes made by men. And then all of a sudden, you just see that flip. And when I saw what was happening to the music industry in the mid-90s, and spoiler alert, a lot of the reason why you and I connected or reconnected was with regard to what happens when a business model flips like that. And that's the story of, taxi drivers or corner shops or, the whole digital disruption or technology disruption piece, which I find emotionally and intellectually fascinating. So a lot of my time is how do you end up on the right end of the fork?
A big thanks to our main sponsor, TYX Studios. Based here in the heart of Tileyard, if you're looking for an amazing place to record your podcast, Jack and the team have got everything you need. They've built some top-notch podcast, music, photography and content studios that are perfect for bringing your ideas to life. Plus, they offer memberships so you can get the most out of their beautiful co-working spaces too. Check them out at www.tyxstudios.com. Big shout out to Jack and everyone at TYX Studios for supporting us on our journey.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, clearly not the easiest upbringing. We've talked about quite a bit about this in the past. What I've always loved about it, clearly you're a very bright guy, right? So were you always academic at school? You say that the school, you didn't necessarily go to a particularly well-funded school, not an easy part of London that you grew up in. In terms of the success you've achieved, despite what might have been quite a tough time through school, you've got an incredible brain. But did you shine at school?
I did shine at school, but more importantly, what I really they're about, and I can name them on one hand, I won't on this podcast, of people who said things to me that changed my life, just changed my sense of it all. I was brighter than a lot of the people in the class, but by no means the brightest. But, 2 words a lady said to me. There was a wonderful home economics teacher. She was South African Hungarian, of all things. And I was in the playground at the age of 11, and she came up to me in the playground and says, they talk about you in the staff room. You could go all the way. Aim high. 2 words.
Amazing.
Changed my life.
I think I used to get spoken about in the staff room, but it wasn't not in a positive sense. That's amazing. So it's incredible, isn't it? How those little sound bites, it's certain key people in your life at different stages of your life can just be a trigger. And do you think was that profound? Do you think?
Oh, genuinely, I can remember it to this day. I can remember where I was standing. I remember looking, why why are they talking about me in the staff room? And what does that mean? But again, it's one of the reasons why I spend so much time mentoring. A lot of people come, why do you spend all your, why? I'm just like, there is nothing that you will be able to do that would have the greatest input to output ratio as a human being as mentoring.
Fantastic.
One conversation, one email, one phone call can change your life. Why wouldn't you? I just don't see why you wouldn't.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of that at the core of what we do here, actually. We'll come to that, no doubt, a bit later. I mean, in terms of, so academically, you were bright. We always said you clearly had two brains. No human can be that clever with just one. But maybe you've just got a whole brain. Maybe I've only got half a brain. But I think for me, in terms of ambition, we sort of looking at ambition. Did you feel that as you were growing up, were you an ambitious young man?
I wouldn't say ambitious because I just didn't know what things were. It's very difficult, but a number of people listening may be able to empathise. So at the age of 14, I was sent on this reading week, which was actually 3 weeks, hilariously, up at, there's a wonderful trust for bright poor boys called Villiers Park. And I got to spend 3 weeks at Oxford University during the summer at St John's College, Oxford. And it's the first time I'd been on an overground train.
Wow. Yeah.
And then I met all these people that had never, and I just remember I was having food and I said, I've never eaten food like this. And the other people going, well, what are you talking about? So I didn't have those horizons. I mean, it was very nice for Mrs. Tamsas to ask me to aim high, but I couldn't even see what was around me in many ways. So I wasn't ambitious in any sense of I want to get there because I didn't know where there was. What I did know was that my parents came to this country for a better life. I knew that everything was, in relation to what I could do. And, in order to sort of, it was much more about excelling than being ambitious.
Yeah.
But also, the way I'm wired. I don't see things as a zero-sum game, right? I don't see that in order to win, you need to lose, which unfortunately is something I see a lot everywhere.
Agreed. And that's an interesting, there's a balance there, isn't there? And a lot of people get that wrong, I think. In terms of, okay, so you went to school, you were doing well. Law school, was law at that point something you knew you wanted to, that was a road you wanted to go down?
really, so I loved the law. The idea of it being the rules and learning the rules, I found it intellectually fascinating. I remember this again, a conversation, second year at Warwick University, outside one of the lectures, there was a conversation about there were these lawyers who had fridges in their office with beer in it, and they worked for a record company. And I asked the question, which I've been asked about a million times in my career, which is, why does a record company need a lawyer? And that's the first time I didn't know what an in-house lawyer was. I didn't even really know what lawyers did, really. The vast majority of people will watch it on television. Maybe they'll watch Suits now, et cetera, but you don't really know what it is or have the overall context for it. But an in-house lawyer, that was just like, I don't even know what that is. But that's the first time I had any inkling of that. And then fast forward a few years, I went to a law firm at the time which had the biggest media law department because I wanted to go, of course, because of this fridge. Hysterically, I drink everything apart from beer, but let's leave that to one side. And then I saw an ad for a job in a record company just after qualifying. And I spent the first 2 or 3 interviews peering over, trying to see if the fridge was there. And you know what? The fridge was there.
That's what, in the good old days, eh? So it's interesting. I mean, I've just spent the weekend with my sister and her family and my family, and her daughter's about to go to uni, wants to do law. And funny enough, I mentioned you because I think it's that understanding that you can go to any sector, and you can really follow your passion. So I think once you got into you got that job clearly. Was it affirm, sort of, did it reaffirm that actually this is the world I want to be in?
Oh, absolutely. Very, 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 very quickly. The guy who hired me is very much my mentor, my hero. There's a chap by the name of Fran Neverickler, who went on to become chairman and CEO of PPL. But before that, he'd spent 25 years at Warner Music and was one of the people who actually shaped what business affairs was. And as I say to young lawyers, that's the equivalent of being taught by Yoda.
Yeah.
when he was around, we would have these discursive conversations about, you know, what seemed to be about stuff. And then I'd come out of it understanding how the intercompany royalty worked, what that issue was with that particular manager, and why you shouldn't do that anyway going forward. And he also opened lots and lots of doors for me as well. He seconded me to the BPI, which is when I got to understand the industry politics, and I was a sort of cultural liaison between the two, put me up for a role at DCMS, and really, you know, sort of joined the dots for me. But on the first day of my joining at Warner Music, he said to me, and this is the mid-90s, he said, look, there's going to be a world where it's not going to be about bits of plastic, it's going to be about bits and bytes, and there's going to be a celestial jukebox where all this comes down, and we need bright young chaps like you to figure it out. Fran was a visionary.
Another key sort of phrase from a mentor type character as well that clearly resonated.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and understood, you know, some of Fran's words. You know, if you ever had a drinking games with him, the word pragmatic always came through. Understanding the human element of it, understanding that this industry is an ecosystem rather than necessarily an industry. In many ways, it's an ecosystem because, you know, you're having to deal with people's egos and how they feel and they are. But really, for me as well, that bit of my brain that likes to see how it all fits together at the back, that's the best way to navigate it.
Talking of egos and working with artists, well, our first connection, one of your jobs was to sign bands and to drop bands, and I never talk about my past. It's the old running gag, apart from all the time. And so I was in a band in the late 90s, and you inadvertently signed the drop notice, didn't you, to effectively ruin my life at the age of 28.
What happened? To be very fair to Ultra, Google them, guys. They're on YouTube.
No, please don't.
There was a long time MD of East West Records, as it was then, a gentleman by the name of Max Hole. Max left to go to Universal, where he went on to have another storied career there. And what happens in the executive merry-go-round is acts get dropped. So I remember a gentleman by the name of Tim Wilde, who's the business affairs guy. He was on holiday, and I was sent in to East West basically to go through and send lots of drop notices. And I suspect that one of them might have been of yours.
Some would argue it was the best, probably did the world a favour. And it's funny, isn't it? Again, sliding doors. You sort of wonder where you might well have gone had that not happened. Luckily, I think for us anyway, we went on to probably better things. But it's a great time. So Warner Music, you're learning the business, I suppose. At a major record label, really exciting time. As you say, that era was a wonderful time, wasn't it, for the music industry? Albeit there was change coming. You've always been inquisitive with change. You then ended up moving across sector. What drove you to that?
Yeah, it was I can remember it super clearly. So at the time, I was head of business affairs for what we call the central division. So that's anything that isn't the frontline two labels. So in current money, anything that isn't Warner and Atlantic fell into another bucket. Now, the thing was, is they kept trying to promote me out of that bucket, but I found that bucket really, really interesting. So in that was the US artists in the UK, the weird and wonderful joint venture labels where we had things like ZTT, which is sold off, Eternal Records, where we had the crazy dance music, Blanco Negro, which was a joint venture with Jeff Travis, and syncs and premiums and industry and building, new pressing plants and all of that stuff I found much, much more interesting. And then a tiny little subset of that was this new media stuff, which then just grew up. And I was asked to look at a deal for a company which was a precursor of YouTube. It was called iChooseTV.com. Don't look for it. It's not there anymore. And this guy said, look, I've got an idea where we can snack on content.
Interesting.
Never heard that.
Yeah.
Said, yeah, we think short form video is going to be a huge thing. And news, and people are going to sit at their desk, and while they're having a sandwich, they'll watch short form content. And
there's something in that.
And I set up a beautiful deal, and when I was told it breached guidelines, I handed my resignation with a broken heart. Didn't even have a job to go to.
Wow.
And I set up my exit interview with HR. I've got to go on the other side and get some rights from you, or we're all screwed. That wasn't the word I used.
No.
They said, don't go. We're setting up a joint venture. Warner Music, Sony, EMI, and Sky, called Music Choice. And it's the year 2000, dot-com boom, everything's going crazy. It's about to float. We'd like you to be the GC. And the business plan was 24-hour music, ad-free, no DJs. And they offered me a spectacular amount of money for me then, and pre-IPO shares. And so I was going off to that job. And then I happened to bump into a friend of mine who was the company secretary of Capital Radio. And we were in Monaco and we were having a chat saying, you got a great business, but my goodness, you don't understand content. You don't understand your value of your own formats. Who Wants to Be a Millionaire was yours. You know, you're doing this, you're doing that, you should do that, you should do that. And I ended up sort of talking myself into a job. So I ended up going to Capital Radio, and there was still the little bit of me that remembered the sticker coming at me from Kenny Everett. This is the Trump-like weave going on here. So I didn't go to Music Choice. First time I ever got thrown out of someone's office was when I broke the news that I wasn't going to Music Choice, and then I went to Capital Radio for a few years. But I really grew up during those years. Yeah. That was understanding content, branded content, some of the first ever podcasts, the Ricky Gervais podcast, monetizing content. I worked with these two clients of Capital Radio who believed all the world's music would end up on a phone called Nokia and BlackBerry. And that whole kind of brands, content, digital piece was really, really fascinating to me, as well as, you know, ending up doing a super class 1 nil premium merger of equals, being responsible for, at one point, nearly 1,000 DJs, which was just crackers thinking about it.
Unbelievable.
And dealing with a FTSE floated business as well. So, and they also had a joint venture record label, so I could still do a bit of rock and roll. But yeah, so for me, I'd learnt the right side, I'd learnt the advertising side, content side, the commercial side, the corporate side. And then when that company did a merger, which I was dead set against and said it would end up in disaster, I did a talk to one of my law firms who I instructed called Lewis Silkin, because they did all my employment law work, really frustrated, saying I can't find any lawyers that are focused on the future. I can't focus on this. And they said, well, we'll listen. Come and speak to our media department. It's like, we've got a media department? Anyway, so I ended up doing a talk. And then 2 lunches later, they were like, do you want to set up your own thing?
Born in King's Cross and brewed right here at Tileyard, Two Tribes is one of the fastest growing and most exciting independent beer brands. Founded with the creative community front of mind whilst brewing great beer. You'll not only find them in supermarkets and some of your favourite local pubs and restaurants, but in art galleries, festivals and music venues too. Award-winning beer Two Tribes focuses on more than what's in the can or glass. It's an opportunity to create memorable moments in great places with fantastic people. Check them out by visiting www.twotribes.co.uk and see what they're up to on Instagram at Two Tribes Brew. And please remember, always drink responsibly. So sit back, relax and enjoy the podcast.
So what a journey. So Walthamstow, Monaco into global, and then Lewis Silkin. So you ended up effectively as a partner, Lewis Silkin.
Started as a partner.
Did you have a business plan of your own at that point? Did you sort of think, right, this is an important moment in my career. Where do I want to go for the next 5, 10, 15 years?
Well, to be honest, I recycled the presentation that I did, where I said, look, I foresee a decade of discontinuity. And it's actually the title of the presentation was Media Out of Its Comfort Zone. And I said, anyone that's doing anything commoditized is going to get eaten. And anyone that needs to do that, well, what do you mean? I said, well, don't act for musicians. Act for a musician that wants to become a label, or a label that wants to become a publisher, or a brand that wants to become a distributor. Value is going to be based on the lockstep of change. And that was the heart of the business model. And Lewis Silkin, whilst it didn't have a media team, as you and I would call it, they had a brilliant brand practice and they had a great technology practice. So I thought, well, if you bolt content onto that, that could get really, really interesting. And during that time, look, acted for Bacardi on Groove Armada, or acted for Cadbury doing the drumming gorilla, or acting for Ford on its Bond stuff, etc., etc. That for me, it was really, really interesting. And they kept saying, well, aren't you going to do any music stuff? And I said, look, I'm not doing any signing artists to labels. There's plenty of lawyers that can do that. But if an artist wants to do something more interesting, or there's a manager, and that's what I did. I really submersed myself entirely in that direction. And then about 2 weeks in, a small client of the firm, which was Nokia, was sponsoring Reading Festival. And they said, is there anyone who can do a download contract? And I think I can do that. And then ended up working with Nokia and BlackBerry for years, doing a significant amount of their work as they pivoted into services. Did a lot of work for brands, which is how you and I first met or reconnected. Doing a talk on branded content.
Remember it well.
And for me, it was really about the heart of that disruption was that whilst content was king, context is what you monetize. And actually, it was much more interesting. You remember Paul McCartney was signing deals with Starbucks. Prince was giving away his albums. Radiohead doing In Rainbows. It was a really, really, really tumultuous time. And, I didn't meet Daniel, catch the name, until the end of 2007. So all of this was way before then. And the record industry was looking in a pretty parlous state when it came to actually managing the transition. So for me, I really wanted to focus on the brands and I wanted to work on digital. But just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
Interestingly, looking at sort of, I've always seen you as a visionary, a pioneer. We use a lot of these sound bites at Tileyard actually of what is it that people within this community have in common. I think a lot of it is a mindset. There's also a lot of it about being very good at building successful businesses that make money. In terms of what turns you on, is it, because you seem to have a very good knack of backing businesses. You get involved through 11, which we'll talk about in a minute. You're an advisor as well as you've got your legal background. What is it that really gets you excited? Do you like the idea of being part of something that is commercially exciting and successful, or is it
just
something
success
that might change the world slightly? Yeah.
No, I mean, I'm in for, people say, oh, I'm into evolution, not revolution. My family come from the only island in the world the dodo existed. So evolution isn't what you want. Revolution, industrial revolutions, we survive all the time, but we've got to understand these new business models. So what I love working with are people, technology, business models, which actually create rather than, a delete, right? I often say to music technology companies, you get put in one of two buckets. Are you a maker? Are you a taker? And often lots of those platforms that are dub takers become huge makers. YouTube, described as an engine of copyright theft by the IFPI in early 2006, now brings, a lot of money to the industry. Is it enough? I'm not going to go there. But, you've got this opportunity to be able to create new paradigms. And so seeing things that shift the needle, shift the dial. And for me, these things do come in cycles. So in 2012, I saw another storm coming. And I said to my partners at Lewis Silkin, it's time to hang up my red pen. I want to get into the advisory world because I see another turn of the wheel coming. And there are these technologies coming. And it's in my first business plan of AI, Web3, as it's now called. I used to call it just blockchain back then. And immersive experiences that I think are going to be game-changing. And people aren't going to come to me as a lawyer. They're probably going to come to me as an advisor. So I was going to go up and set up an advisory business. And they said, well, why don't you do it here? So I set up 11, which is a spinal tap gag.
It's one louder, isn't it?
It's one louder. And with the opportunity to basically be a strategic advisor for incumbents and insurgents. So for incumbents, I work with some big companies, some big platforms, some big technologies on how to navigate the digital disruption piece, but also very determinedly and specifically love working with what people often dismiss as startups, but scale ups and brand new ideas on bringing them to market. Because actually, in any organism, antibodies are strong, right? So if you've got a brand new idea for some Web3 collectible business, an incumbent industry's antibodies will do everything it can to wipe you out and get you out of the system. And it's not necessarily malign, it's not necessarily aggressive, it's just what happens. But actually, if you can get your narrative right, if you can get your team right, if you can focus on building, creating value, get the right people around you, you can see some enormous successes.
It's interesting. One of the things I was going to talk to you about is, what are in your opinion, the key? You're a successful in your own right, but you've also been part of lots of successful other businesses and ventures, and advised some amazing people. In terms of we mentioned team, timing, money. Is there one thing that you think sort of stands out? You mentioned obviously the opportunity to build that business back when you were at Warner's and the startup, the YouTube type startup that. Was that a timing thing? Whatever happened to that? Did that ever materialise?
Well, I think the founder of that went off to build a music video streaming site. I think it was VidZone that it ultimately pivoted into, and there's a company called Vivo, which I've acted for since pretty much its beginning as well. Yeah. So it's one of the only companies I've ever called up and said, "Hello, I really, really, really want to work with you before you launch," which took me back to that conversation. But look. New business models, and now I think we're legally required to talk about AI at some point. But the AI stuff, I've been on for a while now.
Absolutely, yeah.
And working with some fascinating companies from the likes of JukeDeck and AI Music and MyPart and Rota and all these businesses, many of which have exited to far, far bigger companies than anyone in the music industry. But what fascinates me is not the tech; it's what it does for you.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, my daughter's 17, super bright, really into technology, and she's, but she's a little bit on that, the AI friend or foe. She sees a little bit more of the latter. Where do you sit with that? I mean, obviously, it's part of the world we live in. Do you have a positive relationship with AI?
For me, if I'm being simplistic, AI is a tool. And there are very, very positive and constructive and brilliant things you can do with tools, fix things, build things, grow things, make them stronger. But also they can be used maliciously. And the most dangerous thing you'll own right now is a car. As I found out, someone's just rear-ended me. But in order to drive a car, you're taught at great length how to use it. There are rules of the road. There are things you have to adhere to. There's insurance, and there's all these other things that are as well. At the moment, you've got an element of people driving around without road signs and without understanding the power of what they're driving. So right now, really, we're at that sort of understanding gap. This could solve everything, right? This could cure cancer. This could render most medicines. It could take away all sorts of tedious work and create new opportunities and be able to grow and evolve at scale. Or it can be used to weaponize division. It could be used to influence elections and or mindsets and be used from a deepfake perspective. So I see it as the most powerful tool. What differentiates it is that actually, strictly speaking, it's not a tool, it's an agent. It can act autonomously, but we don't want to frighten the kids at home now, do we?
Well, it sort of leads quite nicely into the next question. Tileyard is, for those that don't know, Tileyard is a community. It's a bit old school. It's real people physically, kind of approximating daily, building businesses and being creative in one place in London and now in the north, and hopefully in more locations, in the future. How important do you think it is, particularly when you're being creative, to be around other human beings?
I think that Tileyard for me is one of the things that you take all the credit, and you and Paul and Michael way back in the day should take all the credit for this, but I'm pleased to have been on the journey the whole way. But I remember, what I always say is that, Tileyard was grown, not built. It's much more like farming. Understanding where you plant things, where things will catch, where they'll grow, what needs to go fallow. I've seen how you've programmed it over the years. I remember my very first talk before it was Tileyard, was here with me and Benji Rogers and the guys at Autonomy. We gave a talk here on future business models and talking about reverse business models seem to be the way. And you and I having a conversation about, well, what's the reverse of the studio business? Studio business, you get a big room, you hire it out for a short amount of time, you flipped it. Small rooms hired out for a long period of time. But that wasn't enough. What you needed to do was have all of those elements, the way you daisy chained those studios together, what we built around them. We need to bring in lawyers, we need to bring in promoters, we need to bring in merchandise people, and planting the things around. And there's a number of people that you've said no to over the years because it wouldn't be good for the ecosystem. It wouldn't be good for all those flowers to bloom. So I think that importance of having all the elements, how do you make sure that the climate is right? How do you make sure that the ecosystem is right? How do you understand the placement of those people? And I remember, that Vinyl Cafe was or what became known as the Vinyl Cafe, but having the cafe at the heart of it was always part of the plan. There had to be that point where people would bump into each other. I always saw it because I'm a child of a certain age, almost like Arnold's Bar in Happy Days or Cheers, where everyone would come in.
Yeah, the heart of the community.
The heart of the community. Yeah. And I remember once walking in to Vinyl, and Nile Rodgers was in one corner, Duran Duran were in another corner, and Right Said Fred were in the other. And I said, that's it. The work is done.
I got very excited when Right Said Fred came up. It's been one of the privileges I've had over the last 12 years building this thing with Paul and the guys is, meeting some unbelievable people, of whom a number of them are very well known as well. But it's, one of the things I want to do over the series is obviously talk to as many of those people as possible. Can't think of a better way to kick it off than with you, Cliff. One question I thought, what can I ask everyone that I sit with? And it's a difficult one, isn't it? But one thing I was going to ask you is, if there's one thing in the world today, the world we're in, that you could change, what would that be? It could be anything.
To be honest, I just think it's the power to listen rather than hear. I think that, even if that's just to music, frankly, rather than just to other people, my sense is we've got a generation of young people that hear music, but who sits forward and listens, as they're skipping away, etc. But this is where I sound like an old man.
It's hard not to, isn't it? It's particularly. I've got teenage kids as well, and you're right. The way consumption now is very different, isn't it? To it was 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, and it's not better or worse, but what you do realise is that actually that capacity, the generosity to sit back and just listen, the capacity to actually understand what the other side's coming and where they're coming from, more than anything. You'll have seen people turn up to meetings or negotiations or board meetings spoiling for a fight, and when you do that, you just can't listen.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and I think in terms of certainly from the perspective of what's going on here and where we're going, one of the things you've always been fantastic at is sort of predicting the future, the mystic qualities that you have. If there's one thing in terms of where you think this business might be going, obviously we're music centric, but the creative industry is media. Is there anything that you think in the next sort of 3 to 5 years it's going to be particularly sort of disruptive that's coming our way?
Look, we're going to have lots and lots of new opportunities and threats, like everyone does. The music industry, often people thought, it was full of coke-addled idiots, which may or may not be true. But we were one of the industries that got hit first, right? And that same discontinuity wave, go and chat to someone who worked at a newspaper, or go and chat to someone who worked in, certain branches of certain stores, department stores, they're just gone and empty. Look at the high street and everything. So that discontinuity wave, AI is going to rewrite the business model for education. What does that mean? What does it mean for medicine? What does it mean for education? What does it mean that? So that's consequential. For me, I think the biggest opportunity in the music industry is this connective layer of data, which sounds really, 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 really boring. But actually, it's tremendously exciting, and the opportunities are huge. If you look at the most successful and powerful companies on the planet, every single one of them has had a hockey stick growth due to their use of data. Working with sports clubs and brands that I do, the opportunities to tap into data, what it can do. We, as a music industry, we've got so much to learn. The Econest and algorithms and things like that move the needle a little bit, but I'm working with some extraordinary technologies in relation to You know, everyone's talking about super fans, but I was a super fan. But this industry's got to get a lot more curious and listen to data. I get it. I often say to people, you know, there are reasons and there are excuses. I understand the reasons. The idea that A&R could become A&I, you know, feels quite scary. But if you could start understanding what people want to listen to, maybe it'll make your A&R better.
Yeah.
You know, so there's this whole great replacement theory. All great replacement theory, from racism to AI, is based on ignorance. Once we learn how to do all of this stuff, the opportunities are absolutely legion. And I'm seeing this in the world of live. I'm seeing it in the world of merch. I don't think we've even gotten started with regard to what people want to buy, what they want to consume. The difficulty is it's going to look a lot more different from what we sold in the past. And what we've got to do is jump on those opportunities now.
Too right. You excited about the future?
Oh, very much. It's not boring, that's for sure. I mean, look, I think anyone that's in a role that can be commoditized needs to be thinking about it. You know, I often say to people, if you're worried about AI in music, worry about the poor lawyers. Yeah. If you think of what most lawyers do day in, day out, reading documents, drafting documents, proofing documents, the most profitable, bigger things that law firms do, due diligence, disclosure, all that can be done in seconds now. Seconds. Doesn't mean the end of lawyers. It means we need to look at another business model. So what we do need to do is be focused on these new business models. So if you're focused on the new, like, you know, I spent the last 20 years determinedly focused on that, then, you know, it ain't boring. If you're, I don't know, a music lawyer and your job is signing artists to labels.
Cliff, I could talk to you all day. Thank you so much. Brilliant way to kick the series off, and can't wait till the next one. Come and do series 2.
Thanks so much, Nick.
Thanks for listening to The Secret Sauce with me, Nick Keynes. If you love this episode, make sure you go to Tileyard.com to find out more about this amazing community. And catch us next time for more insider stories from the heart of Tileyard. Until then, stay creative and keep an ear out for the next big thing coming your way. As always, recorded at TYX Studios.